Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Gerardo Michel, and I'm a fourth-year psychology major and philosophy minor. My project is titled, Does Children's Negative Emotion Differentiation Moderate the Relationship Between Emotion Regulation and Psychopathology? Bit of a lengthy title, but let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So for our introduction, there is no doubt that our country is currently experiencing a youth psychological health crisis. According to the National Alliance of Mental Illness, uh, 1 in 6 youth aged 6 to 17 years old experiences a mental health condition each year. There are many possible ways that we can address this crisis. One of the ways is through a pathway known as emotion regulation. So this refers to the different ways that we respond to our emotions. For example, you might be familiar with suppressing your emotions and not showing them to other people. Another piece of this project is the topic of psychopathology, and this involves mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety disorders. The central piece of this project is, of course, negative emotion differentiation. This refers to experiencing negative emotions as being different from each other. For example, feeling angry versus feeling sad. So studies have established that there is a relationship between emotion regulation and psychopathology, but the relationship does depend on whether the strategy is contextually adaptive or maladaptive. An example of an adaptive strategy is cognitive reframing, which is when you think about a situation in a more positive and constructive way. And an example of a maladaptive strategy is expressive suppression, which I had just brought an example of for emotion regulation. Negative emotion differentiation and emotion regulation have been found to be related as well, in that adaptive emotion regulation strategies negative emotion differentiation was associated with better emotion regulation if the participants showed higher NED. And NED is, I'm going to just abbreviate it to NED now. NED is going to refer to negative emotion differentiation. And then lastly, negative emotion differentiation and psychopathology are also related in that lower negative emotion differentiation has been found to relate to psychopathology, specifically depression and sometimes social anxiety. And so actually, my project is looking at how all three pieces come together and relate to each other. One of the studies that I had looked into actually found that higher NED was related to better emotion regulation and less symptoms of psychopathology. But currently, there are no studies that have investigated this with samples that are younger than 14 years old. And so my study sought to address this gap in the literature. So for my questions and hypotheses, my first question was, is NED associated with children's symptoms of psychopathology? My hypothesis for this was that more NED would be related to less symptoms of psychopathology. This is also known as a negative correlation. My second question was, is NED associated with the use of emotion regulation strategies in coping with negative emotions? My hypothesis for this was more NED is related to more adaptive strategy use, and this would also be referred to as a positive correlation. My third question was, if there exists a relationship between NED and psychopathology, what is the role of emotion regulation? My hypothesis for this was that emotion regulation may moderate the relationship between NED and symptoms of anxiety. Moderate being a fancy term for a variable that can affect the strength of a relationship. And additional analyses included respiratory sinus arrhythmia. So respiratory sinus arrhythmia is basically a biological measure of your heartbeat in relation to your breathing. And it's also thought to relate to emotion regulation. I will be getting more into the details for that a little bit later, but I also wanted to assess whether that related to all three of these constructs. Now for my methods. I had 106 participants. The data for this project was collected from a larger study conducted by the Emotion Regulation Lab here at UC Riverside. It was a sample of 106 participants whose ages ranged 7 to 11 years old, 59 of these participants were boys and the rest were girls. On the right, we can see a breakdown of the participants' income that was reported by the parents. Half of the sample actually had an income of 40,000 or less, which qualifies as low income. And however, I will note that there were a few participants that either chose not to report their income or the data was missing. So this may not be the most accurate reflection. Now moving on to child race. So we can see that actually our sample was predominantly Hispanic and mixed, and this represents more than half of the sample. And now moving on to methods and how we measured these constructs. So for negative emotion differentiation, we had used self-reports that had been given to the children 5 times throughout their visit for when they came into a lab visit. They were asked during these 5 times how strongly they felt a certain emotion with 4 different intensities. And you can see that in figure number 3. And specifically, we were looking into anger, sadness, and fear. And in order to compute a negative emotion differentiation score, what we did was we took the variance in self-reports for those 3 negative emotions at each time point, and then we averaged them across different time points to obtain one final score of NED. For measuring emotion regulation, we used 2 measures. The first measure was autobiographical emotion interviews. In these interviews, kids had been asked about what regulation strategies they used for coping with negative situations. In the sample, the last 3 strategies had been grouped together as maladaptive strategies for statistical reasons. And the second measure was what I had referred to earlier, which was the respiratory sinus arrhythmia. So again, respiratory sinus arrhythmia is your heartbeat in relation to your breathing. And it's actually thought to be an indicator of better emotion regulatory capacity, although results are somewhat mixed. Okay, and I'm going to abbreviate that as RSA moving forward. And now for psychopathology. So for measuring psychopathology, we used 2 different measures that had been filled out by the parents regarding their children's symptoms. The first one was the SCARED questionnaire, which specifically looked into different types of anxiety. And the second one that we used was the health behavior questionnaire, which looked into internalizing behaviors such as depression. Now on to my results, the funnest part. So my first hypothesis, unfortunately, was not supported. There was no relationship found between negative emotion differentiation and psychopathology. And I will be explaining possibilities about this for why this is the case in the discussion section. For my third hypothesis, however, it was supported. It was actually found that for kids who did not use support-seeking behaviors, there was a positive relationship between negative emotion differentiation and separation anxiety. And this was actually the only significant association to emerge in which emotion regulation was a moderator. And now on to my most bizarre finding, which was that my second hypothesis had been that higher NED would be related to using more adaptive strategies, such as cognitive reframing. But this actually ended up not being the case. In fact, it was flipped around. So I have the statistics on the left-hand side, but I do want to direct your attention to the bar graph here on the right. So again, cognitive reframing refers to thinking about a situation in a more positive and constructive way. And the results showed that for kids who did not use cognitive reframing, they actually had a higher negative emotion differentiation score than children who did use cognitive reframing. So again, not expected, but we'll discuss what this could mean. And now on to my additional analyses, which involves that biological measure. So, well, let me go ahead and hide this for a second. So RSA was not found to be related to negative emotion differentiation, but it was found to be related to symptoms for some types of anxiety, but it depended on regulation strategy use. And this is specifically for children who had a higher resting RSA. So now I'll go ahead and show that overwhelming-ish table. No worries, I'll guide you through what's important here. So just a quick note that for the first box that's on the left here, but right below psychopathology symptoms, internalizing is again referring to symptoms of depression and other anxiety symptoms. And the last box that says total scared is the total score for anxiety that the children scored. So key takeaways. So for kids with higher resting RSA who used cognitive reframing and support seeking, which are known to be those adaptive emotion regulation strategies, there was actually less symptoms of anxiety. And for maladaptive strategies, which is on the right side of that chart, kids with higher resting RSA who did not use these maladaptive strategies also had less symptoms of anxiety. So again, to sum it all up, higher resting RSA was related to less symptoms for some types of anxiety, but it depended on regulation strategy use. And now on to my conclusion. So let's actually discuss what the first hypothesis and the other ones could actually mean. So again, in the first hypothesis, NED and psychopathology was not found to be related in my study. This could possibly be due to methodological limitations. So for this study, we actually computed NED in a different way than previous studies have done. This was mainly because the data that had been collected for this, the data that was used for this study had not been collected with the original intention of measuring negative emotion differentiation. And other studies also used different methods to measure negative emotion differentiation, such as with daily diaries. For hypothesis 2, again, it was found that NED was higher for kids who did not use cognitive reframing. This could possibly be because of the risk of rumination. So it's possible that children who experience more negative emotions, or children who experience negative emotions as being more different than each other, would not want to use cognitive reframing, as this might lead to overthinking about how they're feeling, what specific feelings that they're having, and that can probably lock them in a cycle of negative thinking as well. And then for my third hypothesis that was supported, which was NED was positively associated with separation anxiety for children who did not use support seeking, which is also somewhat counterintuitive, actually. This could be possibly because children who experience separation anxiety can end up experiencing multiple negative emotions, which can then further discourage their attempts at seeking support for their emotions.
Gerardo, in all fairness, you're a little bit over time now, so are you able to bring it to a conclusion fairly swiftly? Excellent.
Will do. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know. So I'll go ahead and just say that for the resting RSA, that was just seen as a more protective factor for, again, some types of psychopathology based on regulation strategy use. So again, our country is experiencing a youth psychological health crisis. This is one of the first studies to investigate this three-part model in childhood. Future analyses, which is why this is emerging research, is because I'm going to investigate how NED could be a moderator between emotion regulation and psychopathology. And I will specifically also look into whether NED is related to depression. And this can have clinical and intervention implications, as we can use this type of research to inform approaches such as mindfulness-based approaches and help address the mental health crisis that we're having in the country. Thank you.
Really terrific, Gerardo, and yet again another wonderful presentation. I feel very. Then might we just stop the recording before we go into Q&A?
Yes.